Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Michelle Bauman.
And I'm Patrick Cordova.
This week we have a special episode of Heroic Media with a special guest, Larry Smith. Larry Smith is the president and CEO of Catholic Charities of Denver. Larry, thanks so much for being with us here today.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
At a recent event, Larry talked about the real war on women, a life of poverty, and that's the subject that we're going to discuss today.
Yeah, and specifically, we'd like to take a little piece of what you said at a recent Theology on Tap here in Denver. And what you said about this topic was that we ask women to contracept. Then, when they're pregnant, we ask them to abort. If they don't abort and they keep the child, many times they are ostracized from their family. They suffer from domestic abuse, they're kicked out of the house, and then they have to raise the child by themselves. We subject them to a life of poverty. So I think this little quote there from what you said recently will really kind of set the stage for how we're going to talk about this.
Sure.
But I think before we get into it too much, I guess our first question for you, and maybe we can kind of all get on the same page, what exactly is the war on women? Because it seems like there's so many different viewpoints to this depending on who you ask.
Right. You know, it's interesting, from a charity's perspective, we see the tragedy that exists when women are living a life of poverty. And so we talk to them about why they're there and how they got there. And if you're a single woman today in the United States of America and you have a child out of wedlock, and last year, in 2013, was the first year, I think, in the United States where more than 50% of the births that took place out of wedlock.
Wow.
Now, if you're a woman and you have a child out of wedlock, you stand a 30% chance, 30% of the time, you will live below the poverty line.
Wow.
That to me is a war on women.
Yeah.
Now the war on women that we hear about sometime in the media is about people who say abortion is wrong or contraception is bad, and they say that's a war on women because it takes away their choices. Well, I would say that a war on women is something that puts women in poverty. And for children, it's even worse. If you're a child of a single mother, 50% of the time, you will live below the poverty line. That's not just a war on women, that's a war on women and children.
Yeah.
And we see the results of that. Catholic Charities of Denver and many Catholic charities across the country that provide emergency pregnancy centers and that provide shelter and housing for those who have the greatest needs, which today is single women with children. We see the outcome of this war on women, and we talk to them. And they not only are homeless, but they feel shame, they feel abandonment. Anything that puts women in that kind of a situation, it seems to me, is the real war on women, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about the real war on women.
Larry, can you just clarify for us, when you're talking about women living in poverty or below the poverty line,
right? What
exactly does that mean?
Well, if you're living below the poverty line, you're at a starvation diet. I mean, you literally have no money. You are many times homeless. You're living in your car. You're living in a motel and motel vouchers that are given to you by homeless shelters. You may be couch surfing. And the problem, we believe, is much larger. Certainly in Denver, the numbers that are reported for the homeless are at the last point in time study that was done in 2013, the number came back at somewhere around 11 to 12,000 homeless people. But when we see people who are homeless and we talk to them, we think the number is much larger than that, especially for women and children, because sometimes they go uncounted because they are couch surfing, or they're living with a relative, or they're living out of a car, and they don't want to be counted. They don't want to. They're ashamed. They don't want people to know that they're homeless. They don't want to come up for a count. So it's a really tough and very tragic situation for these people.
It's nice having you on the show to chat with us about this, because you have like a real pulse on society, because you see these people coming in. And I think it's also nice to see your perspective, because this is really what the fallout of all these rules or regulations or not, looking at both sides of the fence, this is what the outcome of all of this is really, whether whatever side you're on.
Yeah.
This is what happens. And so how do you think that like restriction to contraception and legalizing abortion, et cetera, how do you think that relates to specifically to these women? Like, how does that affect them? How does that increase their poverty or decrease their poverty? Like, what would that do?
Well, I think there's a bigger issue, and the issue is what does abortion, what does contraception do to women, and what does it do to men, more importantly? Because one of the problems that we have when we see this real war on women is there are no men around.
Exactly.
If you go to our shelters and you see these women with children, there are no men there. And when you go to our daycare centers, the vast majority of the children there don't have dads in their lives. So what we've done is we've separated the sexual act, if you will, from the unitive and procreative act that we believe it should be, right, according to our faith, and that we believe God intended it to be. And when you separate those two, then you also separate the responsibility that men have to the women that they love, or in this case, that they're sleeping with. And so men have no responsibility. As a result, many times, they won't even know that the woman is pregnant because it's a hookup event or whatever. And unfortunately, we tell women that you're safe when you take contraceptive. And then if your contraceptions don't work, of course, you always have abortion. Well, as a fallback position, the woman suffers greatly and is the one who suffers most when she has to have an abortion. There's both emotional scars that come from that, there's economic issues that come from that, and she struggles with a great many of these issues. So I think there's a bigger issue relative to what happens in our society when we separate the love from sex and the procreative and unitive value that we have from that union, which should be a marital bond, and we separate that and we turn it into recreation. The one who always suffers the most is going to be the woman, because she's the one who has the greatest risk of being pregnant. And the other thing that comes up that we don't see as much is we don't encourage some of these women, and some would argue rightly so, to put their children up for adoption. Well, then you subjugate the woman and the child to a life of poverty. It's a very simple formula for women if they want to stay out of poverty. Get a high school education, get a job, and don't get pregnant before you get married. The other thing is if you compare children who are from married households with their natural biological mother and father to those that are in a single household with a mother as their provider, the difference is staggering. Almost 50% of the children who are in a household with a single mother as their parent live at or below the poverty line. And if you look at those children who live with just a father, it goes down to 21% live at or below the poverty line. And if you look at those who are with both their mother and their father, it drops to 13%.
Wow.
So for a child, living with your natural biological mother is the greatest determining factor of whether you will live a life in poverty. Not education, not where you live, not your geographic location, but whether or not you're in a two-parent household with your mother and your father.
See, and I think that really highlights the effect that mindset has. I think you really hit the nail on the head there. That's exactly it, because once you separate that procreative, unitive act and you don't have any responsibility in this relationship, it puts women into a position where they're automatically going to be in poverty. They're automatically going to be in these situations where they're having a less than ideal life situation. And God has a plan for marriage and family. And once we and I think it's been since the beginning. The devil's always been attacking us ever since Adam and Eve. He's trying to break the family apart. And it's just it kind of changes a little bit with time, but it's the same theme.
Yeah.
And I think that really illustrates how women, it's truly a war on women. The women are the ones that end up suffering via this mentality and taking part in contraceptive abortive mentality. Most
of the time, too, I think it's interesting, the sexual revolution as we know it, as we hear it talked about, really benefits the man. I mean, he's the one who has open access and no responsibility. And it's really the woman who, it's almost the law of unintended consequences, who suffers the most because of all these other issues. And let's not forget the consequences of chemical or of the pill and other forms of contraception. God made this incredible creature called woman who, we as men should honor, love, respect, and take care of as our duty as a man and as a husband and as a father. And yet we ask them to take contraception, which upsets and distorts their normal biological cycles. It upsets and distorts their normal fertility cycles. And it really puts the challenge back on the woman. And it's not fair. And so when we talk about the sexual revolution, sometimes we forget, who's the real beneficiary of that. And honestly, it's men. Women are the ones that suffer. And so we see that. And we see these women come in, and these are dignified, beautiful women who have have a child or 2 children and don't have a job, haven't gotten the proper education, and don't know what to do. And fortunately, at Catholic Charities, we're able to help them get back on their feet, find them stable housing, stable income, and give them the dignity that God really intended them to have. And we accept them right where they are. That's the other thing I think that's important. A lot of times, society, while it encourages this sexual revolution, right, without consequences, then when the mother actually has a child, we say, oh, that's okay, have an abortion. Well, what a horrible thing for a mother to do, right? To take the life of the child that she's carrying, who is counting on her for the safest environment the world has ever known, which is the mother's womb. And so then she has the child, and what does she do? She suffers, 95% of the women that we have at Father Ed Judy, which is one of our shelters for single women, suffer domestic abuse.
Wow.
And so not only do they have the child, they're then abused by their partner or by their parents or by someone. And we help them get back together and find their way back to dignity and to a life of respect and a life where they can really take care of their children and contribute to society.
We're going to go to a commercial break, but stay tuned because right after this we'll have more here with Larry Smith. Welcome back to Heroic Media. In case you're just joining us, I'm Michelle Bauman.
And I'm Patrick Cordova.
We're here today with Larry Smith, the CEO and president of Catholic Charities of Denver. Larry, in a recent talk that you gave at Theology on Tap, you made a really fascinating claim that I think sort of caught people by surprise. You said, charity begins in the bedroom. Charity begins when we stop objectifying our spouses. What did you mean by that?
Well, one of the things that we see when we look at the shelters at Catholic Charities, and we have 5 different types of shelters, is we see the broken lives of a lot of people who have nobody to care for them. And what I meant by that was that you really are being charitable when you are charitable to the one that's closest to you. Sometimes, it's easy to be charitable to people you don't know. And it's hardest to be charitable to those you love the most. And sometimes we take advantage of those we love the most, right? I mean, you go home, you've had a bad day, who are you hardest on?
Exactly.
Your wife, your children sometimes, those kinds of situations. And what we mean by that is that when we ask our spouses to contracept, we're really not being charitable with them because we're turning them into objects of our desire, right? We're saying, I want you to satisfy my needs, my desires. I want you to be my satisfaction.
Yeah.
Well, when you do that, you're really objectifying the person you love the most.
Right.
And one of the beautiful things that I've discovered in this past year that I've been at Catholic Charities, is natural family planning is something that is not talked about nearly often enough. And it's something that offers, if properly followed, and it's not that complicated, about a 98-99% success rate for couples that use natural family planning. And one of the beautiful things about natural family planning is that it allows you to get in touch with your spouse. It creates a greater relationship. It brings God into the relationship, and it allows you to work with your spouse, to share those fertility cycles, and really be a part of each other's lives. To say, you mean more to me than just sexual satisfaction or sexual gratification. You mean that I love you and I'm going to give 100% of myself to you. And that works both ways, men to women and women to men. So when we say charity begins in the bedroom, we mean that charity begins when you start living a life of love with the one you're closest to. When you start being charitable at the most basic level, right? The most elemental level of the relationship you have with your spouse, then you're being charitable because you're saying, I love you 100%, I'm all in, and I'm going to give you all of myself. And that means I give all of myself or not all of myself, depending on where we are and what's going on in our lives. So that's the beginning. It also means that if you are charitable there, well, then you'll be charitable with your children because you've already established that charitable giving, right, in your relationship. It can't help but overflow where you can share your faith with your children. Once you're sharing that faith with your children, because you've shared it with your spouse, well, then you bring it into the parish, and then you start sharing it with the parish. Now we've created this fantastic cycle of charitable giving. I never worry about when you show up at Catholic Charities to help us, because if you do those first three things, I'm guaranteed to see your smiling face, because you won't be able to help yourself. You won't be able to stop yourself from wanting to be charitable, and you'll be teaching that to your children. And they'll come down and they'll be charitable as well. And it just creates a fabulous cycle of love and life and giving. And that's what we really believe that, Jesus Christ is asking us to do, and the church is asking us to do, right? In our parish and in our charitable activity.
Absolutely. I think that's perfect. Very well said.
Thank
Now,
you.
I think something that's a little more difficult, and I think that's a great plan. How do we approach people, like secular people, at large, because they don't have that understanding of, like, where do you start and how do you develop that mentality so that they can have mutual respect?
It's a great question. And Pope Francis, I think, has given us the answer when he talks about encounter, right? We have to encounter people. We have to sit down and talk to them. We have to meet them where they are. It's hard to say that it's A or B or, C or D, because until you meet somebody and you talk to them and you find out their story, you find out what they're doing, well, you really, there's no one formula. Everybody's a little different. Everybody's got a different story. One of the beautiful things about working at Catholic Charities, and I wish I could take credit for all the success that we've had, but you'd have to meet the people that work at Catholic Charities in the shelters and in all of the ministries that we have in the Archdiocese of Denver. They're so full of love, and they're so about that encounter. They sit down and they get to know these people. They find out what their stories are, and then they start to find out how they can help them right there where they are. Sometimes it's a sandwich. Sometimes it's just listening to their story. Sometimes it's just helping them, find a job or a place to live, or different kinds of benefits that they may get. But really, it's encountering that person right where they are, meeting them there, talking to them, and then it's sharing our love of Jesus Christ through our love for these people. And when we do that, hopefully then they'll start to ask, wow, what's different here? And whether they're in a shelter or they're in a park, or they're in a bar, or somebody you went to college with, it's really getting to know them and then sharing your faith with them on a gradual basis based on where they're coming from.
I think that's so true. Just the idea of personal encounter, as you were talking about some of the statistics earlier, the percentages of women who are in poverty, the single women, and just looking at how preventable that is if we avoid the contraception, the abortion, the promiscuity, if we just have the correct understanding of sexuality as God intended it.
Right.
But how are we going to spread that to other people? It really has to be that personal encounter. We hear so much about poverty and different government policies and how things should be handled. But really, I think it's just showing us that we need this coherent view of the human person. You can't look at poverty as a totally separate issue from sexuality, from human life, from marriage, from family. All these things are interrelated. And I think that really is just bringing that out in what you said.
Yeah, encounter too is not about texting someone.
That's what I was just about to say. Yep.
It's not about emailing them.
Right.
It's about talking to them. It's about having a relationship.
Yeah.
And in our society, it's easy. And I am a fan of technology, so I'm not saying don't use technology, but it's easy sometimes to forget that a conversation, that putting your phone down, turning it off, and just talking to someone makes all the difference in the world. And we forget that, and we see the effects of that at our shelters. We see the effects of that when we work in our kinship programs and we work in some of the other in-home counseling programs that we provide, where these people have nobody to talk to and they have nobody to share their lives with. And when you do, and this smile appears on their face, and all of a sudden you find out the rich history that this person brings and all the beauty and the glory and the dignity that that human being has given to them by God, you're blown away by it. Everybody has a beautiful story if you let them tell you what it is. And it's just taking the time to do that. That's charity, right? And that's charity no matter if somebody's making $1 million and you sit down and you talk to them, or whether they make a single dollar. Right. You have to encounter that person right where they are.
Yep. And I'm glad you mentioned that about the texting, because that's, I think, and I've seen stories, on the internet about technology and how it's just changing our lives. And some ways are very good, and of course, some ways it's detrimental. And I think this is one of those cases where there can't be enough, to be said about having that personal relationship, that personal encounter. Because there's just something that you see an advertisement, or you read a piece of an email, or read a text or something. It just doesn't have the same effect as that personal interaction.
Right. Another thing that we do at Charity that I think is important. We offer our faith through our actions, through our love.
Yeah.
If somebody inquires, wow, that's different, why are you different? We get to share our faith with them, and that's great. And if they, adopt our faith, if they develop a personal relationship with Jesus, amen, right? We've hit a home run. But if we're just able to help them, and we're just able to listen to them, then we've hit a home run because we've done what God has asked us to do.
Right.
So, I don't think we have to be careful not to get too hung up on the outcomes sometimes.
Yeah.
Outcomes are important, but effort, commitment, relationship, encounter is really what we strive for. That's when we're making a difference in other people's lives.
Right. Sometimes we're just planting the seeds and we don't see the fruit that it's going to bear.
Right. We never know where it's gonna pop up and bloom. We can just hope and pray, and we give that up to Jesus, and we say, God, I'm going to do my best, and then it's up to Him, right? And we know that in the end, if we give it to God, we win because God always wins.
Right, exactly. And that's what Jesus taught us, about our walk. Like, we need to live the faith.
Yeah.
And with that charitable aspect that you're talking about that's so central to Christianity. And by that, you will affect so many different people. Christ never says you need to, start this new foundation, or you need to,
Right.
do this, that. People, especially in America, I think they get this idea that they need to do some big extravagant thing in order to change the world or create some magical system that will fix everything. But really, it comes down to that charitable, personable act.
Yeah. Mother Teresa, I think, was the one that said that you don't have to go across the world to serve the poor.
Right.
They're right next door. They're anybody that you encounter, right? We all have a certain amount of poverty that we carry with us, and we all have a certain amount of charity. And what we have found, amazingly and wonderfully so, some of the best givers that we have at Catholic Charities are those who were at one point receivers. So we have a lot of people who were in our shelters who then come back later on to encourage some of the people who are still in the shelter that there's hope. We try and break down our message into two basic constituents at Catholic Charities. There are the givers and there are the receivers. It's easy to focus on the receivers. We all know who they are, right? We see them, they're in our shelters. Sure. We think. But the givers, if you think about it, how do we focus on the givers? And in helping them give, aren't we also helping them receive?
Yeah.
Right? Because it's in giving that you receive.
Right.
So I think sometimes we have to take a step back and realize that charity begins in the bedroom, begins in the home, begins with your family, begins in your parish. It begins with your best friend. It begins with somebody who you don't even know. It's just being kind and smiling. It's offering a helping hand. It can just be saying God bless to somebody. If we were more charitable with each other in small ways, ultimately we'll be much more charitable in big ways. And that's some of the things that we try and focus on and we try and emphasize in everything that we do through our organization.
Absolutely. And Larry, can you tell us a little bit more about all the ministries? I know there are many of them that Catholic Charity runs. Let's, for a minute, just focus on things for women. What kind of ministries do you offer for women?
So Catholic Charities of Denver is very fortunate in that we represent really from conception to natural death within the Archdiocese. We have about 30 some odd ministries. And just for the ones that we focus on around women, starts with the Respect Life Office. The Respect Life Office for the Archdiocese of Denver is housed inside of Catholic Charities. And that's a program where we reach out to children and adults, and we talk about pro-life. Now, I have to just make one little clarification. Sometimes when we talk about pro-life, people think it's pro-birth, but it's not. It's pro-life.
Absolutely.
It's conception to natural death. That's pro-life.
Yep.
Pro-birth is the beginning.
Right.
Right? And so it's really broad. Then we have Lighthouse, which is an emergency pregnancy center where we assist young women who find themselves to be pregnant or wonder if they're pregnant. We offer free ultrasounds. And then we counsel them on the alternatives that they have when they are pregnant. And I'm happy to say that about 70%, 75% of the women who come into Lighthouse who are abortion-minded, once they have an ultrasound, decide to keep their child,
Yeah.
which is a beautiful thing.
People see that life and it changes their hearts.
It changes their hearts,
Yeah.
and it's really fantastic. And in a very short time, we've met with a great deal of success. And we've had about 33 births now as a result of Lighthouse in the last year or so. So that's a great blessing. Then we have Gabriel House. A lot of women who decide to keep their child find themselves in economic struggles, right? What we talked about before. Gabriel House is a service that we work through the parishes throughout the diocese. We just opened our 5th one at El Centro San Juan Diego, which is a part of the Hispanic ministry here in Denver. And what we do there is we offer young women with children or with babies formula, food, baby clothing, diapers, and then educational services that can range from how to be a better parent to how to manage your personal finances and things of that nature. And all those services are provided through volunteers for free. Then the next one that we would talk about is Father Ed Judy, which I mentioned briefly. That's one of the 5 shelters that we service within the Archdiocese of Denver, and it's for single women and their children. Sometimes when women come into Lighthouse and they find that they're pregnant and they have nowhere to go, we put them up at either Samaritan House, which is our largest shelter downtown, or possibly at father ed duty, and they can stay there and they get medical services and food and clothing and things of that nature until they have their child, and then they can stay after they have their child until they get their feet back on under them, and that's another great service. And then finally, the other one that we would focus on is Project Rachel. Project Rachel is abortive counseling, right? Post-abortive counseling.
Right.
And one of the interesting things there is that you think that's for mothers only, but it winds up being for men almost as frequently as it does for women. Because abortion is a traumatic experience.
Absolutely.
You lose your child.
Yep.
Like it or not, when that baby is conceived, it's a being.
Yes.
It's got a soul. And if you abort that baby, you're killing it. And when you kill it, it hurts you, whether you're the man or the woman. So
Right.
Project Rachel is something that we consider part of our women's services, but it also helps men. So it's a
Wonderful.
beautiful thing.
That's fantastic. And I'm really glad that you pointed all those services out, because so many times the pro-abortion movement says, oh, all you want to do is let babies be born, and then you don't care about the mothers, you don't care about anything afterwards. But this is clearly a case where there's so much being done to care for these people. True charity, true love, true things that they can benefit from, food, shelter, etc., help them get their back on their feet. So thank you so much for joining us
Yes,
tonight.
thank you.
We
Thank you,
really
guys.
appreciate your insight on this topic.
Yeah,
So.
thanks very much. It's been a real pleasure to be here and to be at Catholic Charities.
Excellent.
Great.
Stay tuned. Thanks for joining us on this special episode of Heroic Media. Please join us next week for all the up-to-date news on the pro-life issues that matter to you.
Don't forget to write to us with comments, questions, or news tips at news@heroicmedia.org.
And please visit our website at heroicmedianews.org, where you can check out more stories about life and family issues.
That's it for today, but until next time, keep us in your prayers.
God bless.